Ethan Walker had always believed that the world was full of problems he was not responsible for solving. He wasn't heartless, just tired. Tired of life's disappointments, tired of giving more than he received, tired of watching people take advantage of kindness. So when he stepped out of the coffee shop that chilly morning with his usual black coffee no sugar in hand, he told himself, as he often did, that he didn't have emotional room left for anything except himself. He walked with quick, determined footsteps, eyes forward, ignoring the noise of the world around him. But then, a small tug, barely the weight of a bird landing on his sleeve, forced him to look down. And there, staring up at him with wide, hopeful eyes, was a little boy who couldn't have been older than 7. The boy swallowed hard, voice trembling as he said, "Sir, can you help my mom? If you believe the world still needs kindness, compassion, and second chances, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. It truly helps these stories reach more hearts." Ethan froze. He didn't answer immediately because he wasn't sure he could. His instinct was to pull away, to say he was busy, to point the boy towards someone more equipped. But the child's small hand remained gently gripping his sleeve, and those eyes, filled with equal parts fear and determination, seemed to anchor him to the moment. Ethan finally glanced past the boy and saw a woman sitting on a small brick ledge outside the storefronts. She wasn't looking at them. She had her face buried in her hands, elbows on her knees, shoulders trembling as if each breath hurt. Something inside Ethan tightened, a feeling he didn't want, a feeling he thought he'd grown immune to. He wished he hadn't looked, wished he had kept walking before that gentle voice reached him. But now he was connected, however unwillingly, to their quiet tragedy. He asked the boy what was wrong, but the child only shook his head helplessly, the universal gesture of someone too, overwhelmed to explain. Ethan found himself walking toward the woman, pulled not by obligation, but by the heavy, unspoken plea filling the space between them. When he stopped in front of her, she lifted her face just enough for him to see the red eyes, the streaked mascara, and the exhaustion etched deep into her expression. Her chest rose unsteadily, as though she had been holding her breath for hours and still couldn't find enough air. Ethan wasn't ready for the way her pain hit him, not in the predictable surface-level sympathy he had expected, but somewhere deeper. It reminded him of a version of himself he had buried long ago, a version that believed people deserved help simply because they were hurting. The woman's name, he would later learn, was Rachel Carter. But in that first moment, she was just a mother trying not to fall apart in front of her son. Ethan crouched down, trying to make his voice softer, calmer, the way one speaks to fragile things. She tried to apologize between shaky breaths, as if her suffering was an inconvenience. She kept saying she didn't want to bother anyone, that she was fine, that she just needed a minute. But the boy clung to Ethan's arm again, silently pleading for him not to leave. And Ethan realized something painfully honest. No one had stopped for them until now. He asked if she was safe, if she was hurt, if she needed medical help. Rachel shook her head each time, unable to speak. Eventually, with great effort, she managed to explain that life had swallowed them whole in the last few months. Her job had been cut, rent had gone up, and she'd been juggling 3 part-time positions to keep a roof over their heads. That morning, one of those jobs had suddenly dissolved, another business closing, another paycheck disappearing. She had used the last of her savings to pay for her son's school supplies, and they were now weeks behind on bills. She hadn't eaten since the day before. Her son had eaten only once that day. The weight of it all had crashed into her on the sidewalk, leaving her unable to move, breathe, or think straight. Ethan felt something shift inside him, subtle at first, like ice cracking before a thaw. Her story pierced through the numbness he'd wrapped around himself. He thought about how many times he'd stood on the brink of collapse after losing his father, losing his marriage, and losing the home he once believed would be his forever. He remembered how no one noticed, how he had walked the same kinds of sidewalks, invisible in his suffering, how he had vowed never to feel that vulnerable again. But here he was, facing someone else who wore the same brokenness he once carried, and suddenly he couldn't pretend he didn't understand. He took a slow, steady breath and offered to get them something to eat. Rachel immediately refused out of pride, saying she didn't want charity. She said it quietly, not defensively, but with the shame of someone who had been forced to accept too many small humiliations. Ethan respected the resistance. He had fought the same battles, but he insisted gently, without pity. He said he was already heading to grab lunch and would feel better knowing they had eaten too. It was a small reframing, but it mattered. She hesitated, then nodded, defeated not by weakness, but by the reality that her son deserved a full stomach, more than she deserved dignity at that moment. Inside the diner down the street, Ethan watched as the boy devoured his meal with the hunger of someone who had been pretending he wasn't hungry for far too long. Rachel ate slowly, almost timidly, as though every bite was taken from someone else's plate. Ethan didn't interrogate them with questions. He simply listened to Rachel's halting explanations, to the unspoken fear in her voice, and to the whispered apologies she kept giving her son. With every passing moment, Ethan found himself becoming more invested, more protective, more unable to detach. He learned that Rachel had no nearby family, no reliable friends, and no remaining financial safety nets. The father of her child had left years ago and hadn't looked back. Rachel's eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had been strong for far too long. The boy, whose name was Samuel, spoke with a quiet maturity that children shouldn't have to possess. Ethan felt something reach into his chest and grip tightly. Maybe empathy, maybe guilt, maybe the long-dormant desire to make a meaningful difference in someone else's world. He didn't try to name it, he just felt it. When they finished eating, Ethan walked them back outside. Rachel insisted again that they didn't want to impose, that they would manage somehow. But as she said the words, her voice cracked, and her shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of trying to pretend she had control over a life that had been slipping from her grasp piece by piece. Samuel looked up at Ethan again with those same hopeful eyes, and Ethan realized that children had a way of seeing the truth adults tried to hide. He offered to help them get home, but Rachel hesitated, admitting softly that home wasn't much of a home anymore. The apartment was nearly empty. The landlord had begun removing furniture piece by piece after missed payments. The electricity was days from being cut. She wasn't sure how much longer they'd even be allowed to stay. Everything in Ethan urged him to step away before he became too entangled, before his heart made promises his life couldn't sustain. But he also knew he couldn't walk away from them. He had walked away from too many things already. His marriage, his dreams, his sense of purpose. This felt like the first moment in years that something meaningful asked him to show up. He asked if they trusted him enough to let him help with at least the immediate crisis: rent, groceries, basic necessities. Rachel broke into tears again, overwhelmed by the offer. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask why. She only whispered, "Why would you do that for?" Ethan didn't have an eloquent answer. He could only tell her the truth, that sometimes life gives you a moment to be the person you needed when you were hurting, and this felt like his. Over the next week, Ethan found himself woven into their lives in small but significant ways. He helped fix things around their apartment. He brought groceries not as gifts but as shared meals. He helped Rachel apply for stable job openings and drove her to an interview when her car refused to start again. He spent afternoons with Samuel, teaching him small skills: how to tie stronger knots, how to solve simple logic puzzles, how to throw a baseball without hurting his wrist. Samuel looked at him not with dependence, but with admiration, as though Ethan was someone worth trusting. And yet Ethan struggled too. Helping them forced him to face memories he'd hidden for years. He often drove home with a tightness in his chest, haunted by questions about whether he was capable of making a difference without losing himself again. A part of him feared he would fail them. Another part feared he would care too much. But every time he thought of stepping back, he remembered the trembling voice of a little boy asking for help, because he had no one else to ask. One evening, after a long day of errands and helping Rachel organize documents for a potential job, Ethan stood by the door getting ready to leave. Rachel approached him slowly, nervously twisting her hands. She thanked him again, her voice softer than before but steadier, filled with the gratitude of someone finally exhaling after months of holding everything inside. She told him she had gotten the job, that she could see a path forward again, that Samuel had been smiling more, and then, brushing tears from her eyes, she said something Ethan never expected to hear, that he had saved them. Ethan shook his head immediately, insisting he hadn't saved anyone. He'd only helped. But Rachel disagreed, saying that sometimes help is the difference between drowning and surviving, and sometimes one person believing you deserve better is enough to pull you back to the surface. In that moment, standing in the doorway of their nearly empty apartment, Ethan realized something powerful. He thought he had stepped into their world to save them, but the truth was far more complicated. They had saved him too. They had reminded him that he still had something good to offer the world. That kindness wasn't a weakness. That caring wasn't a burden. That he didn't have to shut himself off from life just because life had once broken him. Months later, their lives looked drastically different. Rachel's job brought stability, and Ethan helped her set up a small savings plan. Samuel flourished in school, his confidence blooming like spring after a bitter winter. Ethan had become a steady figure in their lives, not replacing anything or anyone, but adding something meaningful, something trustworthy. He never pressured the relationship into a definition, never pushed Rachel for repayment or gratitude. He simply showed up again and again, letting consistency speak louder than promises. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps more people hear stories that remind them kindness still exists. Before we end, special request, comment below, what would you have done if this child asked you for help? And in that small, quiet corner of the world, Ethan learned a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. Sometimes the greatest transformations happen not in grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to stop walking away. For him, it all began with a boy's trembling voice asking a simple question that echoed far deeper than he ever could have imagined. "Sir, can you help my mom?